The next speaker for today is Alexandra. Alexandra is a technical writer for Google Ad Manager, where she writes the Help Center documentation for publishers and to best implement the tech in their websites and applications. She has a degree in professional writing from Michigan State University. Today she's going to present, technically speaking, improve your code with documentation. This is Alexandra White. Alexandra, welcome to the stage.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, kind of.
Virtually. I have to say, PHP, it was the first language that I learned and will always be the language that I love most. So I feel particularly honored and excited to talk about documentation here.
The honor is all of the attendees and ours. So yeah, just continue. Carry on. See you later.
See you.
Welcome to Technically Speaking, the talk where I hope to convince you all that you'll become better developers, writing better code, by creating documentation. My name is Alexandra White, and I'm coming to you from my home in New York City. Apologies in advance for any noise outside the window. I know this is still kind of new for all of us, and I wish that I could be with you all in Italy so much, hopefully, next year. Today, I'll tell you a little bit more about who I am and how I know what I know, and then I'll define what is technical writing. We'll set some expectations about the kind of documentation that you, a developer, should be generating. I'll talk about the keys to good writing, purpose, and audience. We'll discuss optimizing the deliverables, and we'll review why any of this matters to you. I'll then leave you with some final takeaways. So let's dive right in. For the last year and a half, I've been a technical writer at Google. But before I was a technical writer, I was an engineer. I worked at a local television station in New York City, WNET, and I worked with 4 engineers who had been at the company for 5, 10, 15, and 20 years, respectively. Most of the knowledge of how all of our systems worked was inside of their brains, and as the role of a new junior developer, it was my job to pry that information out of their brains and get it onto paper so that I could do my job. We were expected to support websites as far back as built in 1999, so you know how beautiful those websites were. And that meant that if I had to make a change, I had to go to the engineer who built that website and ask where it was and find all the dependencies. Not very many considering what websites looked like in 1999, but still. And really, that model is completely unsustainable. I was really frustrated whenever I had to go find the developer and talk to them instead of just being able to dive right in and do work. So I decided to tackle the challenge of getting at least that information out from them and then try and learn as much as I could creatively. I launched a blog. I launched a technical blog for our engineers to share their WordPress and infrastructure knowledge with the larger community. All of the websites that were built in the mid-aughts, the mid-2000s and on are built in WordPress. And in truth, I just wanted a blog so that I could learn from my fellow developers how our products worked, but I also knew that it would be beneficial for the larger WordPress community. Of course, a blog could not be the only solution for documentation. The rest of the knowledge gap was addressed with actual documentation, with READMEs, code comments, API reference information as needed, etc. So you're welcome to all of the junior developers who started after me at WNET. I attended an infrastructure conference in July of 2016 and talked some poor guy's ear off about how I believed engineers needed better documentation. But it's a good thing I did because it led to my first job as a full-time technical writer so that I could help our engineers do their jobs more effectively. I'm now in my second full-time gig as a technical writer creating documentation for Google Ad Manager. in our support center. Most of my work is now UI focused, but I do get to act as the resident technical writer, meaning that I can address my team's developer needs. Despite the fact that I now do documentation almost exclusively, I still believe that developers should be hands-on in this process. My job is not to be an expert in the code, but rather my job is to help translate the knowledge for engineers to what I call human-friendly information for the less technical, non-technical, and even technical folks who may need a little more help onboarding into a new position. I'm sure that you've all faced hurdles starting new jobs where you were expected to learn really quickly all you needed to know to become as effective as soon as possible. We all have stared at our screen at a series of files that are confusing or are overwhelming, badly organized, don't make sense. No matter how great of an engineer you are, it still takes time to onboard, and your life is better when there's documentation. So my goal today is to help you walk away with tools for your current self, your future self, your colleagues, and the people who take your job when you've moved on to another bigger and better career. And I've often been told by engineers that I work with, I'm not good with words, or I don't know how to write, but I have great news for you. You are a writer. That doesn't mean that you're writing the next Shakespearean play or Harry Potter, but you are writing every single day. From the emails that you send answering your colleagues about work or about lunch, to your last tweet, you're actively choosing to put fingers to keyboard to create words. Especially these last several months, you've definitely done some work-related communication. In fact, it's never been more important than right now to be able to communicate well with your colleagues in writing, rather than just being able to turn around at your desk and talk to somebody in person. I'm fortunate now that I work at a company which really values technical writing expertise and has the resources to offer engineers documentation support. And let me be clear, I believe that every company who creates products via code should have a technical writer to create and help make that documentation less complicated, make it better, make it more consumable. Having developers write documentation is not a substitute for a professional writer. A technical writer's job, however, is not writing documentation. You might think it is. It says writer in the name, right? But our job is actually information management. Asking questions of our subject matter experts, that's you, and our product managers, etc. You might not otherwise think to answer those questions, or you might not catch everything that your users need because you're focused on building the best possible product. That said, I love working with engineers who are already writing documentation, which means that I can focus on making those documentation pieces better rather than trying to understand every new feature inside and out. So, what exactly is technical writing? I've talked about it a bit, but good technical writing is not Hamlet. Good technical writing is not paragraph after paragraph of flowery languages or reasoning. It's clear, concise, and to the point. When I was younger, I often deferred to Cliff's Notes when I didn't quite get what Shakespeare was trying to say. The purpose of Cliff's Notes was to supplement Shakespeare's text and provide a modern translation and some extra understanding of what Shakespeare was trying to say and the reasoning behind it. The translation is a lot clearer, taking 5 long lines and turning it into 4 shorter lines. However, translation alone does not equal comprehensive understanding. Writing documentation isn't writing exactly what needs to be done in the code, but rather adding extra context to help your reader be successful. By integrating the translation, the content now has context. A great follow-up to this would be a brief summary of what Hamlet was trying to accomplish. Why does the soliloquy exist in the play? The soliloquy could use a README introduction if left on its own. Prose has no place in your documentation. This is not a creative writing exercise. Folks who hear that I'm a writer but don't necessarily know what a technical writer does assume I was a literature major. They assume that I write long essays filled with adjectives and metaphors and beautiful images. But I'll leave that writing to the novelists and the essayists and the poets. Technical writing is clear, concise, and conscientious commentary. It's added value to your work. I want to be clear in setting the expectations for the kind of technical writing that you, a developer, should be producing. Your job is to fully understand products and features that you've built and be able to explain how it works. By writing this information down as documentation, you're more likely to A, understand the work that you're doing, B, be able to explain it to somebody else, and C, remember it in the future. And while things like grammar are definitely important, they do matter in the final product, don't worry so much about writing perfect language while you're writing your documentation. It's more important, get all the information out of your brain first, and then you can make it make sense later. Writing is one of those things like cleaning out your fridge or exercising that some people say, ugh, I hate that. I can't do that. It's terrible. There are people who write every day who enjoy it, just like there are some people who love the adrenaline rush of a run. I am not one of those people. I don't understand it. Good for them. I wish that I could have become a quarantine runner. But writing can be less painful. Some people train themselves because they know it's good for their health. Writing is good for you as a developer. Writing is how I learned to be a developer. When I was at my second year at university, I was asked to teach my intro to web development class how to write CSS. How'd that happen? Well, the TLDR of that is I was asked to build a professional portfolio as one of our earliest projects, and I hated everything I built because I didn't know what I was doing, so I copied a template and then I modified it. One could say I cheated, but in a way that was allowed. I did minimum work with maximum impact, and I think, as I know now, that's fairly commonplace. It's okay to copy code and modify it and make it better. That's how we learn how to do things. When the professor saw my project, she said, "Wow, you know so much, you should teach." And I thought, oh no. Now I need to actually know what it is that I modified and what it is that I did. So I spent the next 2 nights looking through all of my CSS and writing comments to myself to explain what the different functions did. So I knew the difference between display block and display inline block. By writing notes to myself, I was better able to understand my own work, or sometimes the work of the template creator. And I could refer to my own comments and define what the CSS was for my fellow students. After that moment, I was so much better prepared to write my own style because I was forced to understand how style worked. Running is good for your heart and your health. Writing is good for your comprehension of your work. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how you get your work done, as long as you know it's important to write and write well. Writing is hard. Good writing is even harder, but it shows how much you care about your users, your colleagues, and yourself. Documentation should not just be added on top of your work, like sprinkles. Sprinkles are decorative, more often than not, bland, colorful crunch added to the end of a dessert, added on top of your ice cream. But documentation shouldn't be the last thing on your list, added in a small supply just to give your code some flair. It should be woven and integrated throughout your work. In the United States, there's a wonderful box mix of cake called funfetti. Baking this cake results in sprinkles mixed throughout your cake. Documentation should be like what makes funfetti cake great. Integrate your writing throughout the process and you'll get a result that makes everybody happy. Remember, you're not expected to be perfect. You're not expected to have the best writing. You're not expected to have work that even necessarily would be externally published. But having documentation that's not the best, most of the time, is better than having no documentation at all. Not always, but most of the time. So can we all agree that writing is good and important and everybody is doing it? I imagine all of your kind faces giving me a standing ovation, cheering and agreeing with me. So thanks. I'm so excited. Since we agree, let's talk about how to deliver our writing. And in order to do that, it's really important to understand our purpose and our audience. Why are you writing? Why are you creating documentation? And specifically, why are you creating any document? What problem does it solve? Answering those questions is key to your success and the value of the content that you create. Does your document exist to inform someone of something? Is it an overview of the work you've done or inclusive of details that went into creating your work? Does the document exist to instruct somebody how to do something step by step? Instruction and information are useful to both external and internal uses. Is your product required to comply with any federal, state, or local regulations? Have you made any promises to your customers or promises in any contract of any kind? Writing documentation for compliance is a very special purpose, and you should definitely check with your product team, sales team, lawyers, make sure that you didn't promise to do something and then not deliver it. Even more important, though, than the why you're writing is who you're writing for. Audience is the essential consideration. It's the question that every technical writer is asked in every interview. Who are you writing for? Do you understand your audience? How do you learn who they are and what they need? Who will be reading your document and how will they be approaching it? It's easy to categorize the answer as yourself, right? Because you know yourself. But it might not be somebody who looks like you or has your level of education or expertise. And how is your audience actually even reading the content? Are they on a desktop or are they on a mobile phone? Are they taking action immediately or are they reading it as a reference to go back to at a later date? Is your reader coming to your document because they spent the last 5 days in a crisis and think, if I can't figure this out, I'm going to lose my job? You don't know to what degree somebody will be frustrated when they come to your work. When writing, consider the following audiences. The first is the easiest when you consider any form of documentation. You are the best person who can understand your own work, and you're the best person who can clearly explain what you're doing because you're the one doing it. But why does this say past you? Consider the past version of yourself because you're documenting for the good of the person who built the project. It's possible that before you started the product or the feature that you're building out, that you wrote a design document that articulated all of the possibilities of the kind of work that you could be doing. It's possible all of your hopes and dreams from the original document came true. And it's also possible that, like me, I thought I would grow up and become an actress on the stage and perform. The final product's not exactly the same. I still am here talking to all of you and have previously gotten to be on physical stages to talk about technical things, but it's not quite the same as being an actor. I'm not being a character, I'm being myself. Writing documentation fills in the gaps between what you thought a product would be and how the product ended up. Even more crucial than considering your past self is writing for your future self. Future you sometimes forgets what past you has done. How many times have you worked on a project, finished, and been asked weeks, months, or even years later to go back to that project and either fix a bug or add a new feature? While I was at that TV station, I built a Bingo plugin for WordPress version 4.0, and I decided I would open source it and add it to GitHub so that anyone could use it. I didn't have any plans to further maintain it. But just last year, about a year ago this month, in 2019, I released the project in 2015, so 4 years later. 2 separate groups of people reached out to me and asked if they could use the Bingo plugin and said, it's broken, we don't know how to use it. Not surprising, considering WordPress was well past version 5.0 and I hadn't maintained it, which was not great. And I ended up going back and making adjustments, but I had very little documentation for how to use it. I did not practice what I preached. And my PHP was a little rusty. I hadn't written for WordPress in quite a long time, so it took a long time to remember how classes worked and to look at every file and figure out what I actually needed to change. It took some time to remember even how to debug. So I'm sure somebody here has had to go back to an old product and thought, what was I thinking? How did I do this? And wish that they had some documentation. And for those of you who aren't lone developers who work on a team, it's important to write documentation to help your colleagues pick up the slack. When you have another project that comes in and that takes priority, or when you take vacation, you might have something urgent come up and a colleague wants to be able to fix a product for you. And they will be so much happier if you've already left instructions on how to do so. Also, most of us don't stay at our jobs forever, which means that you can really help the developer who comes on after you by leaving helpful information about all of the projects. Leave them organized, leave them in a way to pass the torch on to the next developer. I want to firmly encourage you to write good internal documentation because I think more often than not, that's what's left out of these conversations about documentation, supporting our colleagues. It's the most neglected work. But sometimes, especially if you don't have technical writers in your company, you may actually be expected to create documentation for external users. If you're a web developer, you might find that you need to write instructions for a client to maintain their website. That's what content management systems are for, right? Allowing somebody who doesn't code to update the website themselves. A developer is a key part of making that process seamless, especially if you've customized the website in any way. Writing instructions so that your client can update content to minimize future pain and maximize your ability to focus on your next product. On a larger scale than a single web developer and a single client, if you're building a product for thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of users, the best way to help them use the product is to give them instructions on how to do so. And that way you don't get 1,000 emails saying, how do I do this? This isn't working. Help your users help themselves so you can sleep at night. Once you have your purpose and you know who you're writing for, you can decide how to deliver that information. The best time to write documentation is while you're writing your code. You'll understand your project most when you're building it, and the easiest way to do that is to write code comments, bits of human-friendly information that a machine doesn't care about but makes all the difference in future development. Remember that Hamlet soliloquy? I added modern English as comments within the body of Shakespeare's prose. And the comments have a specific purpose. They interpret Shakespeare's information into modern English. Here's an example of a bad comment. The comment says, set the value of the age integer to 32. And then the code does exactly that, sets the value of a variable named age to 32. Your comment should add context, not define what's clearly labeled. So adding a comment that says the variable age must be an integer, not a string, That's helpful information. Someone could have written out 32 instead of writing the number 32. Even better, explain why. If this variable is used in a function and that function is not necessarily in the same document, add a comment so you know where it's referenced later. It's important to write step-by-step instructions. That can be telling your colleagues, future self, or successor how to modify your project or how to use it. Or it could be external facing, meaning it's for your user to know how to use the end product. Step-by-step instructions can be written tutorials, collections of GIFs, a screencast of how it works, but remember accessibility. Always have written instructions. An image or video does not replace that. Here's an example of some bad instructions. Titles, not helpful, there isn't one. And the instructions say, make a sandwich and then eat it. There's no ingredients. If you've never heard of a sandwich before, this is pretty useless. If you watch The Great British Bake Off, it's like the instructions they give you for the technical challenge. Here are much clearer instructions. I'm not going to read them all to you, but I'll tell you why they're good. This is instructions for making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which is a very common American sandwich for kids going to lunch, and what they'll bring to school. If you're not familiar with that sandwich, all the supplies that you need are in step 1. These instructions are really specific about not using the same knife in the peanut butter jar and the jelly jar, and that way you don't cross-contaminate. Those little details can be crucial. Writing documents from scratch is really challenging, and even full-time writers struggle to do it. Templates are like a map to the type of content that you need in a document, and they set expectations. If you have technical writers available, get their help in creating templates that are specific to your product. I have some examples in a tech writing toolkit that I will share with you at the end of the presentation. Blog posts are documentation that go above and beyond, and that content can serve as instructions for your users, for your future self, and for marketing skills as a developer. For those of you up for the challenge, and really, this is just bonus work. You do not have to do this. It can be a lot of fun. Back at WNET, my colleague Will and I were the most active writers. Will wrote about OAuth in WordPress in a way that didn't exist on the internet at that time. And it was really the post for folks learning how to implement OAuth. By writing this post, he was establishing himself as an expert to the larger community, and it made our team look so much better. Plus, it helped the fellow team members, myself included, implement it on our own in different products. But why does any of this matter? How does any of this actually help you become a better developer? Reading is a fundamental tool to learning something new. Read books, read articles, read other people's documentation. It's how most of us have learned everything from all of our adult lives, from primary school through adulthood. When I was in school preparing for major tests, I really created detailed outlines from the information from textbooks, taking the information and putting my own spin so I could understand it. When I got my first technical writing job, I was tasked with learning to containerize an application with Docker. And I'd never even heard of Docker. I didn't know what containers were. So I took Docker's documentation and followed every step and wrote down everything I did, including where I messed up. When it was time to write my own documentation, it became much clearer to me how to better those instructions because I had written down where I failed and knew where other people could fail. Reading about Docker isn't how I learned how to use it. Actually, writing about how I used it is how I learned. Knowledge is power. If you're a developer who says, this doesn't need documentation, the code explains itself, you're talking from a position of privilege. Just the existence of documentation helps open the product to a group of underserved and underrepresented folks. It's 2020. There's no reason to not be inclusive of all people. 100% of developers who write documentation are better developers. This is not a tested statistic. This is my statistic. I believe it is true, and I believe that you should believe it's true. Not sure if this is actually a priority or not. Product excellence depends on documentation existing. I hope you agree with me that writing is an important part of the development process and that you feel inspired to do a little bit more. So here are some final tips to help you be a better writer. Be concise. You know who wasn't concise? Shakespeare. Hamlet has its place, but it's not technical writing. If the zombie apocalypse were to happen, you wouldn't say, "Warning! People who have once died have now risen and are taking over the earth and eating human flesh." You would say, "Zombies, run, take cover." Start your writing process by emptying your brain. Get all of the information out of your head and onto a page, and once that's done, then you can organize it, then you can make it more clear. But the more information that's out of your head, the better. That said, the more organized it is, screenshots, adding headers, numbered lists, etc. If you believe having a clean database is important, then you should believe having clean and organized documentation is also important. Your documents should address a problem and then solve that problem. If you miss steps, readers will be left wondering how they failed and why they failed. When I was 11, I messed up a brownie mix. A brownie box mix that had 2 steps. I forgot to add the eggs and the brownies were horrible. And I didn't eat them even though I was 11 and loved chocolate. They were that bad. Our documentation existing is really crucial. It doesn't guarantee that our users will comply and that they'll read it and do all the right things, but at least it's there so you can point to it later and say, "Hey, if you messed up, look back, look at this documentation, and they can do better in the future." When you're documenting your code, remember your audience. Remember who you're writing for. If you're writing for an external audience, it's possible the person reading your documentation will have more or less knowledge about the product than you do. The curse of knowledge, you already know so much about your product that you sometimes forget things that are intrinsic to you, such as adding the step to sign in. That's something that somehow it's thought like, oh, somebody should just know to sign into your product. Make sure you add that step. Just because a person is smart and well-informed in their own specialty doesn't mean they know anything about what you do. And similar to a user experience process, it's really important to get feedback before you release your writing. Have your colleagues look at what you've written and see if they can be a judge if your documentation is clear. You wouldn't release your code without bug checking, right? So make sure that your documentation is checked. And if you get to the end of your project and no writing has been done, you'll probably be overwhelmed. Make your life easier and write as you go. You know the most about your project as you're building it. So remember, write like you have a piece of funfetti. Integrate sprinkles of comments and documentation throughout your process, and you'll have something clear, concise, and completely understandable. Thank you so much.
So here we are. Thank you, Alexandra, for the nice talk. Now we have, I think we have some time for questions. If any one of you wants to ask them in the chat. I've already seen that you've linked a couple of resources there. So I've seen text writing classes and a link to a list of tools and reading proof things. So that's a good start. If there's, sorry, Tokyo.
Oh, just to say thank you again so much for having me. And if anybody has more suggestions of tools or reading that you found useful, please let me know. I would love to continue to update my archive of information.
Okay, great, thank you. Sorry if there's any background noise from me. There's a leaf blower outside my window.
Still?
Bad timing.
I thought you told
Yeah,
them to go away.
No, they came back, sorry. Since I'm not seeing any other question, I wanted to ask one myself, and I would ask you if you think there's a requirement to be a developer first to become a technical writer, or not, if you can become one without being a developer first.
So on my team of technical writers, my team is 7 writers under 1 manager for one of the billion products that Google has. I'm the only one who was a developer before. So there are technical writers who learn the language to be able to communicate with our engineers and try and understand the product, but they're coming from it from a totally different lens than somebody like me who was building websites and building infrastructure before I became a technical writer. So it's interesting. It's good to know that information when you're working with technical writers, if you have them at your company, to know some folks may know what you're talking about more than others. And if you're interested in becoming a technical writer, you already have so much knowledge in order to do so. You have background information that not all technical writers have, so it's to your advantage. I think you are muted, probably because of the leaf blower.
No, they went away another way.
Again.
Okay. The nice thing about being live, I'm not seeing any other questions for now. Let me check. Nope. And so maybe just a single follow-up still from me. What's the career progression if you're not a developer then? You need to do some particular studies or start in a particular field?
It is ideal for you to have had some writing experience, and that could be that you decided you could be anything. You could be, if you're in tech already, a product manager, a UI designer, an engineer, any person. You could be a scientist or a musician. If you take the time to work in open source and write documentation and have writing samples of some kind, that is what you need. Ideally, I think a lot of companies will look for either a technical background or a writing background, but if you show writing samples and show that you can do it and understand it, then that's the primary method of saying, I can be a technical writer. I think there aren't very many college or university programs at this time for undergraduates to do this.
Okay, in the meantime, we got a question from Pieter. How do you keep your documentation up to date?
That is, I'm exhausted trying to think about that because it's really hard, especially when you work on a really big product. I think it's important to prioritizing the newest thing, the newest updates first, followed by what is the most used features and making sure that it's important to create relationships with my stakeholders. So my, again, engineers and product managers, and say, if there are updates, send me an email or file a request. I think when I was a developer and there was no technical writer and I was responsible for doing all the things, as I think many people have experienced in their jobs, knowing, again, what's the most important thing for your users, because they matter before we matter. What I think is the most important is only somewhat true. If all of your users are using a feature, it's really important to make sure that that documentation is the most up to date. And sometimes we fail. Sometimes there is a whole section of documentation which hasn't been updated in a long time. And a good way to hold ourselves accountable is actually to include a timestamp, which might be embarrassing to say, this section hasn't been updated in 2 years, but it helps your users know this information might not be 100% true.
Okay, another question from Daniel. Is the technical writer role most of the time available only on big size company? Otherwise, the way would be freelancing for different small to mid-sized company only when they need it?
It's a good question. My last job, I guess was a smaller company of 150 people. Now I think Google has 200,000. I don't know, a lot of people who I will never know their names. I think it doesn't necessarily matter how large the company is. There are startups that have technical writers. It depends on how much the leadership values documentation. And if they're smart and they care about their users' experience and the product, again, has enough users, because if your product has it, I understand technical writing not necessarily being in your first 10 hires, but by adding a technical writer early, that means that it's easier to onboard new folks internally, and it's easier for adaptation for users. I think the field is still smaller, but it's growing really rapidly. We are hiring a lot still, and we're trying to spread the word of technical writing out into the tech world.
Okay, another question that starts flowing in from Michael. How do you know what to include and what not to include? I ask because certain things might appear tacit to some and not necessarily to others.
Know your audience. So sometimes you might include more details than necessary for the most advanced users, but I think it's good to lean on the side of folks who don't know as much. If your product is a very technical product, if you work for a cloud company and you expect most of your users to have come from other clouds, you can guess they know certain language, they know how clouds work in general. Though that understanding of expectations can help you write your documentation. But I think it's hard. Something I mentioned in my talk, the curse of knowledge. We know what we know, and it's hard to remember what our users don't know. So erring on the side of caution and giving a little too much, a little extra information that will be useful to your users. Remembering to tell folks to sign in is a silly step that is I see missing from my documentation internally all the time and needs to be added to help folks. Silly, but necessary.
That's right. It's not silly. Understandable. As a follow-up, do you do something like code reviews on what you write, like programmers do, or maybe using someone who is the intended audience to do that, to try to fix that?
Absolutely. The best way, especially for new products and new features, having our documentation tested by other writers or even by non-writers, possibly better by non-writers or somebody who's never experienced that feature, because they will find steps that we miss. Things like clicking a certain point in the navigation that we might have just thought, oh, I just know to go to the left side and click on admin or something. Technical writing reviews, while they don't happen all the time, for small updates, we can just publish, but for big content, so important to have stakeholder review.